Want to know the scariest word in the landlording business? Well, stay tuned for today's episode of the Lady Landlords Podcast. Hi, my name is Becky Nova. I am your host and the founder of Lady Landlord. And today we're going to be talking about that one thing that every single landlord has a nightmare about and that holds so many people back from getting involved in landlording at the beginning. And today I want to talk about the tips of how to navigate this situation and how not to get stuck in these nightmares that so many landlords find themselves in. Now, what we're going to be talking about today is evictions. All right. So an eviction is really that legal process that you have to go through to get somebody removed from your property. Okay. This can happen for two different reasons. One, this could be happening because of a non-payment of rent, or another option would be if they are violating the lease in another fashion. Okay. So it could be for either reason that you would have to evict that person from your property. Why is this so important is because I feel that there are so many women and lady landlords that are so afraid to get involved in the landlording business because of the possibility of having to evict somebody down the line. Now, I get it. It can be very expensive. It can be a nightmare to go through. It could take a very long period of time, and it's a lot of stress. And that's what we're trying to avoid, right? As landlords, we're usually looking for financial freedom. We're looking to be able to travel, to spend time with our kids, to leave that dead-end job, whatever it may be. Now, all of a sudden, to take on the stress of an eviction absolutely can be our worst nightmare. But I'm here to tell you that really evictions are not the norm. We should not assume that every tenant that we're going to have is going to end up in eviction, because that's really just not the case. I'll be honest, even in Lady Landlords, we talk about them because we are a place where you come with your problems, right? If we all just made posts being like, hey, got paid today, I don't know, I guess we'll check in next month, everything going smooth. Honestly, we wouldn't be as much of an entertaining group as we are reading everybody else's problems. Because listen, I know I'm not the only one that ever sat there with some popcorn and maybe a glass of wine and kind of read through some of the stories and what other people are dealing with. Evictions really are in the minority of situations and how landlording and that relationship with the tenant really ends. But there are a bunch of tips that I can really share with you today about how to avoid having them be the worst of the worst of the worst evictions. So I'm going to start with saying this in a caveat. This is one of the reasons why it is so important to follow a process with your screening. Okay. I'll be the first to tell you that, listen, all because you screened perfectly does not mean that you're not going to end up evicting a tenant. Those things are not an exact science. All because you have a very well-qualified tenant does not necessarily mean that you're not going to end up having to evict them. But it is going to mitigate your risk. Okay. So what I mean by having good screening process in place is, one, it should really be documented what your screening process is. Also, you need to lay out what criteria you are looking for. What credit score do you accept? What income do you need? What DTI, debt to income ratio? What are the factors that you're looking for? It can be very important upfront to have that very clear. Everything that you do as a landlord, we need to think, hey, how is this going to look if a judge is reading it in court? Okay. That means, once again, if you text with your tenants, if you email with your tenants, however you communicate, remember all of those things. How would we feel if that all of a sudden was shown in court? Okay. So our screening process, one, is going to mitigate a risk because we're going to really screen out for the best tenants, the best chance of not having to evict. So really thinking about eviction starts with screening and starts with that tenant placement. It's very important to make sure you get the right person there, that you're checking references, that you're following up on their documentation, and really take your time to do that due diligence to find the right tenant in. Okay. Like I said, that does not mean that your tenants will be perfect. I'll be perfectly honest. One of the worst tenants I ever had was probably the most qualified tenant I ever had. He had over an 800 credit score, 6-figure salary, absolutely no debt. But honestly, he was just a very unbright man. And he just did not understand the way that things worked. And we had to go after him in court for a lot of the damages that he had done. I saw the pictures. When he moved out and he had 3 young sons, all of our walls, just 4 feet and below, were just covered in crayon and marker and pen. This was stuff that was actually not just the walls, but even like the kitchen cabinets, anything the kids could touch. Kitchen cabinets, the oven. I didn't know you can actually draw in an oven, but those kids found a way, let me tell you. And they only lived there for like 3 months. We didn't even get to a place of quarterly inspections. And this was already clearly not a fit We thought we were going to have to evict him, but luckily he moved out on his own. But really, we can mitigate our risk by looking for the best possible tenants up front. So make sure to have that documented, make sure to have that clearly laid out, make sure to have that from the start. So hopefully you don't even have to get to the things that we're going to talk about. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're going to have to evict, one of the most important things there is understanding your local and state laws. Okay. This is something that's going to be different from state to state. New York and California, notoriously more difficult to be able to evict from, especially since the pandemic, versus some other states, Florida and Texas, a little bit easier to do that, a little bit more on the landlord friendly side compared to where I am in New York and where a lot of our members are listening in from in California. So it's so important to make sure that you follow those procedures. One of the reasons for that is if you do not follow the exact procedures of your state, it could actually make you have to go back to the beginning. What I mean is, let's say in your state, for example, you have to post a 5-day notice to pay or quit. A pay or quit notice says, hey, either pay the rent or quit as in move out, or a cure or quit, which is when there's a lease violation. You're asking them to cure as in fix it, or once again, quit as in move out. Let's say you have to do that on a 5-day notice. Then you have to post a 10-day notice, for example, and then you can start that eviction process on day 11. Well, let's say instead you forgot that 10-day notice. Now all of a sudden you're going and trying to file your case after day 10 with the courts saying, hey, I'm having this problem. I've had this problem now for almost 2 weeks. I want to make sure to be able to evict. They might look and say, hey, you didn't follow the process correctly. You got to go back to the beginning. You got to go start over, wait your 5 days, do your 5-day notice, wait then your 10-day, do that, and then, hey, come back to us. So if you do not follow that process, that can really cause a lot of problems. That is something that I know we want to be able to save money, especially when we have a tenant not paying us. How difficult it is to say, oh my God, now I have to go pay an attorney. We all know attorneys are not cheap. But you might be saying, well, I don't want to go spend that money now on an attorney. I'm already not making money from the tenant. Now I'm going to lose in both places. But I'm here to tell you that it might still be worth your while. It might still, that time, that stress, that headache, and really making sure that you follow the procedure to collect back anything that you can, or at least get your property back as fast as you can, still is probably going to be worth the money of using an attorney. Also, when we talk about following those procedures and with an attorney, a lot of ways that an attorney will work for an eviction is that you still have to pay them a retainer. The retainer fee is a certain amount of money that you pay in advance to make sure that that attorney then does said work. But if money is not used by that attorney for their time and their services, you actually deserve that money back. So for example, one of the evictions that I went through, we had to pay, I forget the exact amount, like $1,600 or like $2,000 in a retainer. Then we had the schedule of fees from that attorney that said $400 for the 5-day notice, another $400 for the 10-day notice, and then another $400 for the processing of the eviction at that point in time if it was moving forward, and those 2 notices did nothing. If we got to that point, well, our peoples ended up really being able to respond after, I think it was the first notice. So at that point, we didn't use the entire retainer. The attorney did not provide all those extra services that really added up to like the $1,600 that we had gave them. So that money actually came back to us. So listen, I get that it's money that you have to lay out at the beginning, but when you think about your rental property as that investment, it might be something that really is going to be a fit for you. So I do highly recommend using an attorney in those situations just to make sure that you have that process correct. Also, if you have a property in an LLC, in some states, you do have to use an attorney for that eviction and you are not able to represent yourself. Okay. Because once again, then you have your property as an LLC that is a business entity. So therefore you need an attorney to do the eviction rather than if the property is in your personal name, and then you could do that. So trust me, there would be nothing worse than going through the 5-day notice, the 10-day notice, filing the case, serving everybody, getting to the court, and all of a sudden having a judge tell you, hey lady, you actually can't do this. Your property's in an LLC, you need an attorney, right? So always very important to make sure you understand your local state laws, especially when it comes to an eviction process. All right. So following your procedures, understanding what that process looks like, that's going to be catamount here. Next, you want to make sure that you're actually not collecting partial payments. We talk about this a lot in the Lady Landlords Facebook group. What ends up happening is it also kind of resets the clock. If, for example, you have a tenant that you're trying to evict either for non-payment of rent or once again, a lease violation, but you then accept their payment, even if they give you $5 instead of paying the full rent, but even if they give you that smaller amount of money, that actually is saying that you are accepting funds in exchange for them living in that property. So that can actually reset your process. That can reset the eviction. That all of a sudden now you're like, great, I'm on the 10-day. We now have the court date next month coming up. Great. But if you accept money on that first of the month, might not be all that you're owed, but that can actually reignite the beginning of that entire process. So that can be very lengthy and very expensive. This is something why it's so important to be very careful using certain money sending apps. If you're accepting rent through Venmo, Chase Quick Pay, Zelle, Cash App, any of those types of things, that's a place where when somebody sends you money, you don't have to accept it. It just automatically gets put in your account. So someone can sit there and send you that dollar, a penny, and all of a sudden they paid you for that month. And now they've restarted your eviction process. So this is why it's very important to use the proper payment portals to make sure that you cannot accept partial payment. So that way they are not sending you these smaller funds that would then put you in this poor position. Okay. During that time though, when you are asking that tenant to leave through that pay or quit or cure to quit, do make sure that you understand what you can and cannot say during that time. It would be great if you're able to really negotiate and get them out. But once you hire an attorney, they should really be engaging for you. That is communication you do not want to have. For example, a tenant's probably going to reach out to you. They're probably going to be kind of upset that you are setting that notice or that now there's legal action going against them. That would be great if you can negotiate before you even get to that place to either say, hey, listen, this clearly isn't working. You clearly can't afford it. Let's just cut our losses here, see what you can do with maybe an early termination fee. Some people sometimes have to do cash for keys. It's actually sometimes easier and more beneficial as much as it pains us to have to pay a tenant to leave. But sometimes it's the easier way to go. So try to negotiate if you can, but once that attorney is engaged, then they need to be taking on that communication. Do not get into a text message war. Do not get back and forth. Once again, always remember that everything you do and say, especially in this world of text messages, emails, even voice recordings, all of those things can end up in court. And you really want to make sure that everything that you are doing is within legal means, is professional, and also is the right way to engage with the tenants. So at that time, if you do choose to engage with an attorney, then they are the ones that are to have that communication with the tenants. You really are not supposed to at that point in time, but try to see what you can do, even through that attorney, to negotiate to get them out. If you can still settle, there's probably some better opportunity there than going through the full length of eviction. And honestly, that happens more times than not, that you are able to come up with some agreement that would get that tenant out. Once again, maybe that's just waiving the early termination fee and just saying, hey, get them out of this property at this point in time. Maybe that is cash for keys, where then you're really paying them to be able to leave, or coming up with some agreement that would work to be able to get them out of that property. This was one, actually, the closest I ever got to an eviction was with two tenants that we had. They were sharing a 2-bedroom, two male friends that were living in the apartment. What was interesting is at first, one of the two guys, he was late his first month or two and paid the late fee for the property. But then all of a sudden, the other tenant, his friend, just stopped paying. This was something that we also went back to them. We had both people on the lease. So all because one is not paying does not mean the other one is not responsible. What was interesting about that is one of them was really in a place where he had just had a kid with his girlfriend. He was really trying to do things right and have a safe, clean home to be able to bring his baby into that property. He was really also trying to keep his credit score up because at some point he wanted to be able to have his family in a home. So we explained to him, hey, this is your friend. He is not paying the rent. You are on the hook just as much. So we're not just going to be evicting him. We're going to be evicting you. And that will go on your record. That will be an issue for you for either the non-payment, how that's going to impact credit, because we do report our payments to a credit bureau. That's something you need to have set up. Here's a caveat, ladies. You need to have that set up before all of a sudden things go bad. If you say, hey, now that these people aren't paying me, now I want to take their credit, it's too late. You need to be able to set up with the credit bureaus that reporting early on. This is why I highly recommend using a payment portal. I use Rent Ready. I love them. I'm able to get my rent there. I'm able to stop the partial payments. I'm also able to report to credit bureaus from the beginning of them moving in. Then that way, well, they'll get rewarded if they're paying on time for good credit. But I can't then say, hey, I'm now upset that you're not paying, so I guess I'm going to report to the credit bureaus. It doesn't work like that. You have to do things from the beginning with that. But this tenant was really upset that his credit was going to be hit and that he might end up with an eviction record, which would really hurt him trying to get a property moving forward or another rental. So we were actually able to use him to really talk to the other tenant and say, hey, we need to take care of this. The one friend also was able to pay some more of the rent that we were owed. And then he took on being able to collect back the money that was then owed then to him. It took us out of the equation. That was great because then kind of going through that eviction process, we were less out of pocket, which then allowed us to have a little bit more space to be able to negotiate. And then he should be collecting from his friend. Once again, they're both on the same lease together. So it's not that they each owed us $1,000. They jointly owned us 2,000. Didn't really matter whose money was paying what. We don't care how they set up the bedrooms, who was paying what their arrangement was. Together, jointly, they owed us that $2,000 a month. One of the other reasons it's great to see what can be negotiated, regardless of if you're using an attorney or not, is because the whole goal at this point in time is to protect your asset. Okay. This is a place, great. I understand how painful it is to lose that rent coming in month to month to month. I understand that a lot of you might still have a mortgage on that property. And then now you're coming out of pocket, or now you're in a financial difficulty because you're now paying that mortgage and people are living for free, right? And they're living in that property and not upholding their end of the contract here. But that couple $1,000 or whatever your rent might be is still probably going to be less than if there's any damage to that property. Damage to a property is just going to set you back even more. Not only do you have to pay to now get that property back in order, but that property might then be down and vacant for a month, 2 months, 3 months, depending on how long it's going to actually take you to fix that said damage. So that is really going to put you in a much worse position. So sometimes it's just so important to see what you can do to just get the tenants out of the property as soon as possible with the least amount of damage. Because to be honest, one of the most difficult things to do in this entire process is to collect that money at the end. Okay. So let's continue going this process here. You put up the notices that you necessarily needed. You went to court. Sometimes it might be 2, 3, couple times that you're going to have to go to court, once again, depending on your state and the process, to really get that tenant out. Then you have to actually have a sheriff come out to then oversee this tenant actually leaving, right? So there's a lot of steps and a lot of time that this is going to take there. But now let's say you get those tenants out, but you evicted them because they owe you money. Or even if it was a lease violation, they might stop paying you rent once they know that they're going to be evicted and that you start that process. Great. In that court case, you can still get that judgment. A judge can still sign off and say, great, these tenants being evicted owe this landlord X amount of money. But all because you have that judgment does not necessarily mean you are going to collect that money. That is actually probably the hardest part of the entire process. Even the eviction itself and even getting the tenants out, collecting that money in the end might actually be the most difficult. One, if you go through that whole process, there's a lot of times that there's no way that a tenant's going to be like, oh, you have a piece of paper that says I owe you money. I guess now I'll pay you. They already had a lease that said that you paid them. Now all of a sudden you think that they're going to pay you because there's a judgment. A lot of tenants are not. Or if they were evicted, it could also just be because they purely didn't have the money, right? Once again, totally unfair to you, but that could just be the situation that maybe they don't have the money to be able to pay you. Then yes, there are ways to garnish wages. There are ways to garnish a tax refund. All of those different options are available, but it's going to take time. Usually in those situations too, you're receiving a very little payment over time, and it's going to take you a lot of time to get those payments set up and processes in place because you're dealing with the government to help you garnish those. You can use a collections agency to help you get that money that you were then owed. But same thing, that is a long process. It is never guaranteed. And on average, it's usually that you have a loss of about 30% of what you were supposed to collect that does go to that collections agency, Listen, 70% is still better than zero, but that can still be a huge hit to that. So, hearing all that through, what I hope that you take away from this episode of the Lady Landlords podcast is upfront, do the best that you can to mitigate the tenants that are coming in so that way you hopefully never get to the eviction space. Then the second biggest takeaway here is regardless of if you use an attorney, which also I do highly recommend once again, or if you choose to move forward with the eviction yourself, do the best that you can to really negotiate some type of agreement to get the tenants out as soon as possible for the least amount of damage and the least amount of rent owed in the end. So I hope that helps just rest your mind on really the true situation with evictions. And now you would be ready to go out and get that next rental property because you know how to handle it. Okay. So if you have ever experienced an eviction, head over to the Lady Landlords Facebook group. Tell us about your experience. Tell us what that was like going through, because I'm sure you also have some insights that'll be able to help our community. So would love to hear them. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining me today for this episode of the Lady Landlords Podcast. Please do make sure to hit that subscribe button down below so you do not miss another episode of the Lady Landlords Podcast. We release new episodes every single Tuesday. See you all back in the Lady Landlords Facebook group. Thank you for listening to the Lady Landlords Podcast. If you're feeling stuck in your real estate investing journey, visit lady-landlords.com to book a 15-minute orientation call with me and see if you're ready to join our mentorship program. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter and join our Facebook group for exclusive real estate investing tips and offers. Invest with confidence. Become a Lady Landlord today.